Hello, we're back. We're going to read another short story today. This one's also kind of short. I know we've been doing a lot of shorter ones. Pardon me, I have to adjust something. There we go. I know we've been doing a lot of shorter ones while we get ready to read a longer book, likely Conan. But more updates to come on that because I'm still deciding. It's just been a busy... I've been training more lately, so I've been busy. But anyway... Yeah, we're going to read The Abominations of Yondo by Clark Ashton Smith. Bear with me for like 30 seconds to a minute, and then we'll get started. All right, let us enjoy together The Abominations of Yondo by Clark Ashton Smith. The sand of the desert of Yondo is not as the sand of other deserts, for Yondo lies nearest of all to the world's rim, and strange winds, blowing from a pit no astronomer may hope to fathom, have sown its ruinous fields with the grey dust of corroding planets, the black ashes of extinguished suns. The dark, orb-like mountains which rise from its wrinkled and pitted plain are not all its own, for some are fallen asteroids, half buried in that abysmal sand. Things have crept in from nether space, whose incursion is forbid by the gods of all proper and well-ordered lands, but there are no such gods in Yondo, where live the hoary genii of stars abolished and decrepit demons left homeless by the destruction of antiquated hells. It was noon of a vernal day when I came forth from that interminable cactus forest in which the inquisitors of Ong had left me, and saw at my feet the grey beginnings of Yondo. I repeat, it was noon of a vernal day, but in that fantastic wood I had found no token or memory of a spring, and the swollen, fulvous, and dying and half-rotten growths through which I had pushed my way were like no other cacti, but bore shapes of abomination scarcely to be described. The very air was heavy with stagnant odors of decay, and leprous lichens mottled the black soil and russet vegetation with increasing frequency. Pale green vipers lifted their heads from prostrate cactus bowls and watched me with eyes of bright ochre that had no lids or pupils. These things had disquieted me for hours past, and I did not like the monstrous fungi with hueless stems and nodding heads of poisonous mauve which grew from the sodden lips of fetid tarns, and the sinister ripples, spreading and fading on the yellow water at my approach, were not assuring to one whose nerves were still taut from unmentionable tortures. Then, when even the blotched and sickly cacti became more sparse and stunted, and rills of ashen sand crept in among them, I began to suspect how great was the hatred my heresy had aroused in the priests of Ong, and to guess the ultimate malignancy of their vengeance. I will not detail the indiscretions which had led me, a careless stranger from far-off lands, into the power of those dreadful magicians and mysteriarchs who served the lion-headed Ong. These indiscretions and the particulars of my arrest are painful to remember, and least of all do I like to remember the racks of dragon gut strewn with powdered adamant on which men are stretched naked, or that unlit room with 6-inch windows near the sill where bloated corpse worms crawled in by hundreds from a neighboring catacomb. Sufficient to say that, after expending the resources of their frightful fantasy, my inquisitors had borne me blindfolded on camelback for incomparable hours to leave me at morning twilight in that sinister forest. I was free, they told me, to go whither I would, and in token of the clemency of Ong, they gave me a loaf of coarse bread and a leathern bottle of rank water by way of provision. It was at noon of the same day that I came to the desert of Yondo. So far, I had not thought of turning back, for all the horror of those rotting cacti or the evil things that dwelt among them. Now, I paused, knowing the abominable legend of the land to which I had come, for Yondo is a place where few have ventured wittingly and of their own accord. Fewer still have returned, babbling of unknown horrors and strange treasure, and the lifelong palsy which shakes their withered limbs, together with the mad gleam in their starting eyes beneath whitened brows and lashes. Altogether, it is not an incentive for others to follow. So it was that I hesitated on the verge of those ashen sands and felt the tremor of a new fear in my wrenched vitals. It was dreadful to go on, and dreadful to go back, for I felt sure that the priests had made provision against the latter contingency. So, after a little, I went forward, singing at each step in loathly softness. Sinking at each step in loathly softness, and followed by certain long-legged insects that I had met among the cacti. These insects were the color of a week-old corpse, and were as large as tarantulas. But when I turned and trod upon the foremost, a mephitic stench arose that was more nauseous even than their color, so for the nonce I ignored them as much as possible. Indeed, such things were minor horrors in my predicament. Before me, under a huge sun of sickly scarlet, Yondo reached interminable as the land of a hashish fever dream against the black heavens. Far off on the utmost rim were those orb-like mountains of which I have told, but in between were awful blanks of gray desolation and low treeless hills like the backs of half-buried monsters. Struggling on, I saw great pits where meteors had sunk from sight, and diverse-colored jewels that I could not name glared or glistened from the dust. There were fallen cypresses that rotted by crumbling mausoleums, on whose lichen-blotted marble fat chameleons crept with royal pearls in their mouths. Hidden by the low ridges were cities, of which no stela remained unbroken, immense and immemorial cities, lapsing shard by shard, atom by atom, to feed infinities of desolation. I dragged my torture-weakened limbs over vast rubbish heaps that had once been mighty temples, and fallen gods frowned in rotting passamite or leered in riven porphyry at my feet. Over all was an evil silence, broken only by the satanic laughter of hyenas and the rustling of adders in thickets of dead thorn or antique gardens given to the perishing nettle and fumitory. Topping one of the many mound-like ridges, I saw the waters of a weird lake, unfathomably dark and green as malachite and set with bars of profulgent salt. These waters lay far beneath me in a cup-like hollow, but almost at my feet on the wave-worn slopes were heaps of that ancient salt, and I knew that the lake was only the bitter and ebbing dregs of some former sea. Climbing down, I came to the dark waters and began to lave my hands, but there was a sharp and corrosive sting in that immemorial brine, and I desisted quickly, preferring the desert dust that had wrapped about me like a slow shroud. Here I decided to rest for a little, and hunger forced me to consume part of the meager and mocking fare with which I had been provided by the priests. It was my intention to push on, if my strength would allow, and reach the lands that lie to the north of Yondo. These lands are desolate, indeed, but their desolation is of a more usual one than that of Yondo, and certain tribes of nomads have been known to visit them occasionally. If fortune favored me, I might fall in with one of those tribes. The scant fare revived me, and for the first time in weeks of which I had lost all reckoning, I heard the whisper of a faint hope. The corpse-colored insects had long since ceased to follow me, And so far, despite the eeriness of the sepulchral silence and the mounded dust of timeless ruin, I had met nothing half so horrible as those insects. I began to think that the terrors of Yondo were somewhat exaggerated. It was then that I heard a diabolic chuckle on the hillside above me. The sound began with a sharp abruptness that startled me beyond all reason, and continued endlessly, never varying its single note, like the mirth of an idiotic demon. I turned and saw the mouth of a dark cave fanged with green stalactites, which I had not perceived before. The sound appeared to come from within this cave. With fearful intentness, I stared at the black opening. The chuckle grew louder, but for a while I could see nothing. At last, I caught a whitish glimmer in the darkness. Then, with all the rapidity of a nightmare, a monstrous thing emerged. It had a pale, hairless, egg-shaped body, large as that of a gravid she-goat, and this body was mounted on 9 long, wavering legs with many flanges, like the legs of some enormous spider. The creature ran past me to the water's edge, and I saw that there were no eyes in its oddly sloping face, but 2 knife-like ears rose high above its head, and a thin, wrinkled snout hung down across its mouth, whose flabby lips, parted in that eternal chuckle, revealed rows of bat's teeth. It drank acidly of the bitter lake then. With thirst satisfied, it turned and seemed to sense my presence, for the wrinkled snout rose and pointed towards me, sniffing audibly. Whether the creature would have fled, or whether it meant to attack me, I do not know, for I could bear the sight no longer, but ran with trembling limbs amid the mass of boulders and great bars of salt along the lake shore. Utterly breathless, I stopped at last and saw that I was not pursued. I sat down, still trembling, in the shadow of a boulder. But I was to find little respite, for now began the second of those bizarre adventures which forced me to believe all the mad legends I had heard. More startling, even, than that diabolic chuckle was the scream that rose at my very elbow from the salt-compounded sand, the scream of a woman possessed by some atrocious agony or helpless in the grip of devils. Turning, I beheld a veritable Venus, naked in a white perfection that could fear no scrutiny, but immersed to her navel in the sand. Her terror-widened eyes implored me, and her lotus hands reached out with beseeching gesture. I sprang to her side and touched a marble statue, whose carven lids were drooped in some enigmatic dream of dead cycles, and whose hands were buried with the lost loveliness of hips and thighs. Again I fled, shaken with a new fear, and again I heard the scream of a woman's agony, but this time I did not turn to see the imploring eyes and hands. Up the long slope to the north of that accursed lake, stumbling over boulders of basanite and ledges that were sharp with verdigris-covered metals, floundering in pits of salt, on terraces wrought by the receding tide in ancient aeons, I fled as a man flies from dream to baleful dream of some cacodemoniacal night. At whiles there was a cold whisper in my ear, which did not come from the wind of my flight, and looking back as I reached one of the upper terraces, I perceived a singular shadow that ran pace by pace with my own. This shadow was not the shadow of a man, nor ape, nor any known beast. The head was too grotesquely elongated, the squat body too gibbous, and I was unable to determine whether the shadow possessed 5 legs or whether what appeared to be the 5th was merely a tail. Terror lent me new strength, and I had reached the hilltop when I dared to look back again. But still the fantastic shadow kept pace by pace with mine, and now I caught a curious and utterly sickening odor, foul as the odor of bats who have hung in a charnel house amid the mold of corruption. I ran for leagues while the red sun slanted above the asteroidal mountains to the west, and the weird shadow lengthened with mine, but kept always at the same distance behind me. An hour before sunset, I came to a circle of small pillars that rose miraculously unbroken amid ruins that were like a vast pile of potsherds. As I passed among these pillars, I heard a whimper, like the whimper of some fierce animal between rage and fear, and saw that the shadow had not followed me within the circle. I stopped and waited, conjecturing at once that I had found a sanctuary my unwelcome familiar would not dare to enter, and in this the action of the shadow confirmed me. The thing hesitated, then ran about the circle of columns, pausing often between them, and whimpering all the while. At last, when it went away and disappeared in the desert toward the setting sun. For a full half hour, I did not dare to move. Then, with the imminence of night, with all its probabilities of fresh terror, urged me to push on as far as I could do to the north. For I was now in the very heart of Yondo, where demons or phantoms might dwell who would not respect the sanctuary of the unbroken columns. Now, as I toiled on, the sunlight altered strangely, for the red orb nearing the mounded horizon sank and smoldered in a belt of miasmal haze where floating dust from all the shattered fanes and necropoli of Yondo was mixed with the evil vapors coiling skyward from black, enormous gulfs lying beyond the utmost rim of the world. In that light, the entire waste, the rounded mountains, the serpentine hills, the lost cities were drenched with phantasmal and darkening scarlet. Then, out of the north, where shadows mustered, there came a curious figure, a tall man, fully caparisoned in chainmail, or rather what I assumed to be a man. As the figure approached me, clanking dismally at each step on the sharded ground, I saw that its armor was of brass, mottled with verdigris, and a casque of the same metal, furnished with coiling horns and a serrated comb, rose high above its head. I say its head, for the sunset was darkening, and I could not see clearly at any distance, but when the apparition came abreast, I perceived that there was no face beneath the brows of the bizarre helmet, whose empty edges were outlined for a moment against the smoldering light. Then the figure passed on, still clanking dismally, and vanished. But on its heels, ere the sunset faded, there came a second apparition, striding with incredible strides and halting when it loomed almost upon me in the red twilight. The monstrous mummy of some ancient king, still crowned with untarnished gold, but turning to my gaze a visage that more than time or the worm had wasted. Broken swathings flapped about the skeleton legs, and above the crown that was set with sapphires and orange rubies, a black something swayed and nodded horribly. But for an instant, I did not dream what it was. Then, in its middle, two oblique and scarlet eyes opened and glowed like hellish coals, and two ophidian fangs glittered in an ape-like mouth. A squat, furless, shapeless head on a neck of disproportionate extent leaned unspeakably down and whispered in the mummy's ear. Then, with one stride, the titanic lich took half the distance between us, and from out of the folds of the tattered cerecloth a gaunt arm arose, and fleshless, taloned fingers laden with glowering gems reached out and fumbled for my throat. Back through aeons of madness and dread, in a prone, precipitate flight I ran from those fumbling fingers that hung always on the dusk behind me. Back forever, unthinking, unhesitating, to all the abominations I had left, back in the thickening twilight, toward the nameless and sharded ruins, the haunted lake, the forest of evil cacti, and the cruel and cynical inquisitors of Ong, who waited for my return. Man, that one really is short. That was a quick one. Maybe I'll read another. I'm on a little bit of a time squeeze, but I think we can make it happen. Give me like 3 to 5 minutes to pull up another option that I had set to the side. I will be right back. Alright, let's read The Double Shadow by Clark Ashton Smith. It's a bit longer, and if we can't finish it, then I will finish it tomorrow or Sunday. There should be time. Bear with me for just a moment. Get some water. Alright. The Double Shadow by Clark Ashton Smith. My name is far patron among those who have known me in Poseidonus, but even I, the last and most forward pupil of the wise Evictus, know not the name of that which I am fated to become ere tomorrow. Therefore, by the ebbing silver lamps in my master's marble house above the loud, ever-ravening sea, I write this tale with a hasty hand, scrawling an ink of wizard virtue on the grey, priceless, antique parchment of dragons. And having written, I shall enclose the pages in a sealed cylinder of aurichalcum, and shall cast the cylinder from a high window into the sea, lest that which I am doomed to become should haply destroy the writing. And it may be that mariners from Lefara, passing to and Njor in their tall triremes, shall find the cylinder, or fishers will draw it from the wave in their scenes of Byssus, and having read my story, men will learn the truth and take warning, and no man's feet henceforward will approach the pale and demon-haunted house of Evictus. For 6 years I have dwelt apart with the aged master, forgetting youth and its wonted desires in the study of arcanic things. Together we have delved more deeply than all others before us in an interdicted lore. We have solved the keyless hieroglyphs that guard anti-human formula. We have talked with the prehistoric dead. We have called up the dwellers in sealed crypts in fearful abysses beyond space. Few are the sons of mankind who have cared to seek us out among the desolate, wind-worn crags, and many, but nameless, are the visitants who have come to us from further bournes of place and time. Stern and white as a tomb, older than the memory of the dead, and built by men or devils beyond the recording of myth, is the mansion in which we dwell. Far below, on black, naked reefs, the northern sea climbs and roars indomitably, or ebbs with a ceaseless murmur as of armies of baffled demons, and the house is filled evermore like a hollow-sounding sepulchre with the drear echo of its tumultuous voices, and the winds wail in dismal wrath around the high towers, but shake them not. On the seaward side, the mansion rises sheerly from the straight falling cliff, but on the other sides there are narrow terraces, grown with dwarfish, crooked cedars that bow always beneath the gale. Giant marble monsters guard the landward portals, and huge marble women ward the straight porticos above the sea, and mighty statues and mummies stand everywhere in the chambers and along the halls. But, saving these and the spirits we have summoned, there is none to companion us, and the liches and shadows have been the servitors of our daily needs. All men have heard the fame of Evictus, the sole surviving pupil of that Malagris who tyrannized in his necromancy over Sucerin from a tower of sable stone. Malagris, who lay dead for years while men believed him living, who, lying thus, still uttered potent spells and dire oracles with decaying lips. But Evictus lusted not for temporal power in the manner of Malagris, and having learned all that the elder sorcerer could teach him, withdrew from the cities of Poseidonus to seek another and vaster dominion. And I, the youth far patron, in the latter years of Evictus, was permitted to join him in this solitude, and since then I have shared his austerities and vigils and evocations, and now, likewise, I must share the weird doom that has come in answer to his summoning. Not without terror, since man is but mortal, did I, the neophyte, behold at first the aberrant and tremendous faces of them that obeyed Evictus, the genii of the sea and earth, of the stars and the heavens, who passed to and fro in his marmorean halls. I shuddered at the black writhing of submundane things from the many-volumed smoke of the braziers. I cried in horror at the grey foulnesses, colossal, without form, that crowded malignly about the drawn circle of 7 colors, threatening unspeakable trespass on us that stood at the center. Not without revulsion did I drink wine that was poured by cadavers, and eat bread that was purveyed by phantoms. But use and custom dulled the strangeness, destroyed the fear, and in time I believed implicitly that Evictus was the lord of all incantations and exorcisms, with infallible power to dismiss the beings he evoked. Well had it been for Evictus, and for me, if the master had contented himself with the lore preserved from Atlantis and Thule, or brought over from Mu and Mayapan. Surely this should have been enough, for in the ivory-sheeted books of Thule there were blood-writ runes that would call the demons of the 5th and 7th planets, if spoken aloud, at the hour of their ascent. And the sorcerers of Mu had left record of a process whereby the doors of far-future time could be unlocked. And our fathers, the Atlanteans, had known the road between the atoms and the path into far stars, and had had speech with the spirits of the sun. But Evictus thirsted for a darker knowledge, a deeper empery, and into his hands, in the 3rd year of my novitiate, there came the mirror-bright tablet of the lost serpent people. Strange, and apparently fortuitous, was our finding of the tablet. At certain hours, when the tide had fallen from the steep rocks, we were wont to descend by cavern-hidden stairs to a cliff-walled crescent beach behind the promontory on which stood the house of Evictus. There, on the dun, wet sands, beyond the foamy tongues of the surf, would lie the worn and curious driftage of alien shores, and trove that hurricanes had cast up from unsounded deeps. And there we had found the purple and sanguine volutes of great shells, and rude lumps of ambergris, and white flowers of perpetually blooming coral, and once the barbaric idol of green brass that had been the figurehead of a galley from far hyperboreal isles. There had been a great storm, such as must have riven the sea to its nethermost profound, but the tempest had gone by with morning, and the heavens were cloudless on that fatal day when we found the tablet, and the demon winds were hushed among the high crags and chasms, and the sea lisped with a low whisper like the rustle of gowns of samite trailed by fleeing maidens on the sand. And just beyond the ebbing wave, in a tangle of russet seaweed, we beheld a thing that glittered with blinding sun-like brilliance, and running forward, I plucked it from the rack before the wave's return, and bore it to Evictus. The tablet was wrought of some nameless metal, like never-rusting iron, but heavier. It had the form of a triangle, and was broader at the widest than a man's heart. On one side it was wholly blank, and Evictus and I, in turn, beheld our features mirrored strangely, like the drawn, pallid features of the dead in its burnished surface. On the other side, many rows of small, crooked ciphers were incised deeply in the metal, as if by the action of some mordant acid, and these ciphers were not the pictorial symbols or alphabetic characters of any language known to the master or to me. Of the tablet's age and origin, likewise, we could form no conjecture, and our erudition was altogether baffled. For many days thereafter, we studied the writing and held argument that came to no issue, and night by night, in a high chamber closed against the perennial winds, we pondered over the dazzling triangle by the tall straight flames of silver lamps. For Evictus deemed that knowledge of rare value, or haply some secret of an alien or elder magic, was holden by the clueless, crooked ciphers. Then, since all our scholarship was in vain, the master sought another divination, and had recourse to wizardry and necromancy. But at first, among the devils and phantoms that answered our interrogation, none could tell us aught concerning the tablet, and any other than Evictus would have despaired in the end, And well it would have been if he had despaired, and had sought no longer to decipher the writing. The months and years went by with the slow thundering of seas on the dark rocks and a headlong clamor of winds around the white towers. Still, we continued our delvings and evocations, and further, always further, we went into lampless realms of space and spirit, learning, perchance, to unlock the hithermost of the manifold infinities. And at whiles, Evictus would resume his pondering of the sea-found tablet, or would question some visitant from other spheres of time and place regarding its interpretation. At last, by the use of a chance formula in idle experiment, he summoned up the dim, tenuous ghost of a sorcerer from prehistoric years, and the ghost, in a thin whisper of uncouth, forgotten speech, informed us that the letters on the tablet were those of a language of the serpent men, whose primordial continent had sunk aeons before the lifting of Hyperborea from the ooze. But the ghost could tell us naught of their significance, for, even in his time, the serpent people had become dubious legend, and their deep anti-human lore and sorcery were things irretrievable by man. Now, in all the books of conjuration owned by Evictus, there was no spell whereby we could call the lost serpent men from their fabulous epoch, but there was an old Lemurian formula, recondite and uncertain, by which the shadow of a dead man could be sent into years posterior to those of his own lifetime, and could be recalled, after an interim, by the wizard. And the shade, being wholly insubstantial, would suffer no harm from the temporal transition, and would remember, for the information of the wizard, that which he had been instructed to learn during the journey. So, having called again the ghost of the prehistoric sorcerer, whose name was Ebith, Evictus made a singular use of several very ardent gums and combustible fragments of fossil wood, and he and I, reciting the responses to the formula, sent the thin spirit of Ibith into the far ages of the serpent men. And, after a time which the master deemed sufficient, we performed the curious rites of incantation that would recall Ibith from his alienage. And the rites were successful, and Ibith stood before us again, like a blown vapor that is nigh to vanishing. And in words that were faint as the last echo of perishing memories, the spectre told us the key to the meaning of the letters, which he had learned in the primeval past, and after this we questioned Ebith no more, but suffered him to return unto slumber and oblivion. Then, knowing the import of the tiny, twisted ciphers, we read the writing on the tablet, and made thereof a transliteration, though not without labor and difficulty, since the very phonetics of the serpent tongue and the symbols and ideas expressed in the writing were somewhat alien to those of mankind. And when we had mastered the inscription, we found that it contained the formula for a certain evocation which, no doubt, had been used by the serpent sorcerers. But the object of the evocation was not named, nor was there any clue to the nature or identity of that which would come in answer to the rites. And, moreover, there was no corresponding rite of exorcism, nor spell of dismissal. Great was the jubilation of Evictus, deeming that we had learned a lore beyond the memory or prevision of man. And though I sought to dissuade him, he resolved to employ the evocation, arguing that our discovery was no chance thing, but was fatefully predestined from the beginning. And he seemed to think lightly of the menace that might be brought upon us by the conjuration of things whose nativity and attributes were wholly obscure. "For," said Evictus, "I have called up in all the years of my sorcery no god or devil, no demon or lich or shadow which I could not control and dismiss at will. And I am loath to believe that any power or spirit beyond the subversion of my spells could have been summoned by a race of serpents, whatever their skill in demonism and necromancy." So, seeing that he was obstinate, and acknowledging him for my master in all ways, I consented to aid Evictus in the experiment, though not without dire misgivings. And then we gathered together in the chamber of conjuration, at the specified hour and configuration of the stars, the equivalents of sundry rare materials that the tablet had instructed us to use in the ritual on hand. Of much that we did, and of certain agents that we employed, it were better not to tell. Nor shall I record the shrill, sibilant words, difficult for beings not born of serpents to articulate, whose intonation formed a signal part of the ceremony. Toward the last, we drew a triangle on the marble floor with the fresh blood of birds, and Evictus stood at one angle, and I at another, and the gaunt umber mummy of an Atlantean warrior whose name had been Oigos was stationed at the third angle. And standing thus, Evictus and I held tapers of corpse tallow in our hands till the tapers had burned down between our fingers as into a socket, and in the outstretched palms of the mummy of Oigos, as if in shallow thuribles, talc and asbestos burned, ignited by a strange fire, whereof we knew the secret. At one side we had traced on the floor an infrangible ellipse, made by an endless, linked repetition of the 12 unspeakable signs of Umor, to which we could retire if the visitant could prove inimical or rebellious. We waited while the pole-circling stars went over, as had been prescribed. Then, when the tapers had gone out between our seared fingers, and the talc and asbestos were wholly consumed in the mummy's eaten palms, Evictus uttered a single word whose sense was obscure to us, and Oigos, being animated by sorcery and subject to our will, repeated the word after a given interval, in tones that were hollow as a tomb-born echo. And I, in my turn, also repeated it. Now, in the chamber of evocation, before beginning the ritual, we had opened a small window giving upon the sea, and had likewise left open a high door on the hall to landward, lest that which came in answer to us should require a spatial mode of entrance. And during the ceremony, the sea became still, and there was no wind, and it seemed that all things were hushed in awful expectation of the nameless visitor. But after all was done, and the last words had been repeated by Oigos and me, we stood and waited vainly for a visible sign or other manifestation. The lamps burned stilly in the midnight room, and no shadows fell other than those that were cast by ourselves and Oigos, and by the great marble women along the walls. And in the magic mirrors we had placed cunningly to reflect those that were otherwise unseen, we beheld no breath or trace of any image. At this, after a reasonable interim, Evictus was sorely disappointed, deeming that the evocation had failed of its purpose, and I, having the same thought, was secretly relieved. And we questioned the mummy of Oigos to learn if he had perceived in the room with such senses as are peculiar to the dead the sure token or doubtful proof of presence undescribed by us the living. And the mummy gave a necromantic answer, saying that there was nothing.
"Verily," said Evictus, "it were useless to wait longer, for surely in some way we have misunderstood the purport of the writing, or have failed to duplicate the matter used in the evocation, or the correct intonement of the words. Or it may be that in the lapse of so many aeons, the thing that was formerly wont to respond has long ceased to exist, or has altered its attributes, so that the spell is now void and valueless." And to this I assented readily, hoping that the matter was at an end. So, after erasing the blood-marked triangle and the sacred ellipse of the linked signs of Umor, and after dismissing Oigos to his wonted place among other mummies, we retired to sleep. And in the days that followed, we resumed our habitual studies, but made no mention to each other of the strange triangular tablet, or even the vain formula. Even as before, our days went on, and the sea climbed and roared in white fury on the cliffs, and the winds wailed by in their unseen, sullen wrath, bowing the dark cedars as witches are bowed by the breath of Taran, god of evil. Almost in the marvel of new tests and cantrips, I forgot the ineffectual conjuration, and I deemed that Evictus had also forgotten it. All things were as of yore to our sorceress perception,
There was naught to trouble us in our wisdom and power and serenity, which we deemed secure above the sovereignty of kings. Reading the horoscopic stars, we found no future ill in their aspect, nor was any shadow of bale foreshorn to us through geomancy or other modes of divination such as we employed. And our familiars, though grisly and dreadful to mortal gaze, were wholly obedient to us, the masters. Then, on a clear summer afternoon, we walked, as was often our custom, on the marble terrace behind the house. In robes of ocean purple, we paced among the windy trees in their blown crooked shadows, and there, following us as we went to and fro, I saw the blue shadow of Evictus and my own shadow on the marble, and between them an adumbration that was not wrought by any of the cedars. And I was greatly startled, but spoke not of the matter to Evictus, and observed the unknown shadow with covert care. I saw that it followed closely the shadow of Evictus, keeping ever the same distance, and it fluttered not in the wind, but moved with a flowing as of some heavy, thick, putrescent liquid, and its color was not blue, nor purple, nor black, nor any other hue to which man's eyes are habituated, but a hue as of some unearthly purulence, and its form was altogether monstrous, having a squat head and a long, undulant body without similitude to beast or devil. Evictus heeded not the shadow, and still I feared to speak, though I thought it an ill thing for the master to be companioned thus, and I moved closer to him in order to detect by touch or other perception the invisible presence that had cast the adumbration. But the air was void to sunward of the shadow, and I found nothing opposite the sun, nor in any oblique direction, though I searched closely, knowing that certain beings cast their shadows thus. After a while, at the customary hour, we returned by the coiling stairs and monster-flanked portals into the high house, and I saw that the strange adumbration moved ever behind the shadow of Evictus, falling horrible and unbroken on the steps, and passing clearly separate and distinct amid the long umbrages of the towering monsters. And in the dim halls beyond the sun, where shadows should not have been, I beheld with terror the distorted, loathly blot, having a pestilent, unnameable hue, that followed Evictus as if in lieu of his own extinguished shadow. And all that day, everywhere that we went, at the table served by spectres, or in the mummy-warded room of volumes and books, the thing pursued Evictus, clinging to him even as leprosy to the leper. And still the master had perceived it not, and still I forbore to warn him, hoping that the visitant would withdraw in its own time, going obscurely as it had come. But at midnight, when we sat together at the silver lamps, pondering the blood-writ runes of Hyperborea, I saw that the shadow had drawn closer to the shadow of Evictus, towering behind his chair on the wall between the huge sculpted women and the mummies. And the thing was a streaming ooze of charnel pollution, a foulness beyond the black leprosies of hell, and I could bear it no more, and I cried out in my fear and loathing, and informed the master of its presence. Beholding now the shadow, Evictus considered it closely and in silence, and there was neither fear nor awe nor abhorrence in the deep, graven wrinkles of his visage, and he said to me at last, "This thing is a mystery beyond my lore, but never in all the practices of my art has any shadow come to me unbidden, and since all others of our evocations has found answer ere this, I must deem that the shadow is a veritable entity, or the sign of an entity that has come in belated response to the formula of the serpent sorcerers, which we thought powerless and void. And I think it well that we should now repair to the chamber of conjuration, and interrogate the shadow in such manner as we may, to inquire its nativity and purpose." We went forthwith into the chamber of conjuration, and made such preparations as were both necessary and possible. And when we were prepared to question it, the unknown shadow had drawn closer still to the shadow of Evictus, so that the clear space between the two was no wider than the thickness of a necromancer's rod. Now, in all ways that were feasible, we interrogated the shadow, speaking through our own lips and the lips of mummies and statues. But there was no determinable answer, and calling certain of the devils and phantoms that were our familiars, we made question through the mouths of these, but again without result. And all the while our magic mirrors were void of any reflection of a presence that might have cast the shadow, and they that had been our spokesmen could detect nothing in the room. And there was no spell, it seemed, that had power upon the visitant. And so Evictus became troubled, and drawing on the floor with blood and ashes the ellipse of Umor, wherein no demon nor spirit may intrude, he retired to its center. But still, within the ellipse, like a flowing taint of liquid corruption, the shadow followed his shadow, and the space between the two was no wider than the thickness of a wizard's pen. Now, on the face of Evictus, horror had graven new wrinkles, and his brow was beaded with a deathly sweat, for he knew, even as I, that this was a thing beyond all laws, and foreboding naught but disaster and evil. And he cried to me in a shaken voice, and said, "I have no knowledge of this thing, nor its intention towards me, and no power to stay its progress. Go forth and leave me now, for I would not that any man should witness the defeat of my sorcery, and the doom that may follow thereupon. Also it were well to depart while there is time, lest you too should become the quarry of the shadow, and be compelled to share its menace." Though terror had fastened upon my inmost soul, I was loath to leave Evictus. But I had sworn to obey his will at all times and in every respect, and moreover I knew myself doubly powerless against the adumbration, since Evictus himself was impotent. So, bidding him farewell, I went forth with trembling limbs from the haunted chamber, and peering back from the threshold, I saw that the alien umbrage, creeping like a noisome blotch upon the floor, had touched the shadow of Evictus. And at that moment the master shrieked aloud like one in nightmare, and his face was no longer the face of Evictus, but was contorted and convulsed like that of some helpless madman who wrestles with an unseen incubus. And I looked no more, but fled along the dim outer hall and through the high portals giving upon the terrace. A red moon, ominous and gibbous, had declined above the terrace and the crags, and the shadows of the cedars were elongated in the moon, and they wavered in the gale like the blown cloaks of enchanters. And stooping against the gale, I fled across the terrace toward the outer stairs that led to a steep path in the riven waste of rocks and chasms behind Evictus's house. I neared the terrace edge, running with the speed of fear, but I could not reach the topmost outer stair, for at every step the marble flowed beneath me, fleeing like a pale horizon before the seeker. And though I raced and panted without pause, I could draw no nearer to the terrace edge. At last, I desisted, seeing that an unknown spell had altered the very space about the house of Evictus, so that none could escape therefrom to landward. So, resigning myself in despair to whatever might befall, I returned toward the house. And climbing the white stairs and the low, level beams of the crag-caught moon, I saw a figure that awaited me in the portals, and I knew by the trailing robe of sea purple, but by no other token, that the figure was Evictus. For the face was no longer in its entirety the face of man, but was become a loathly fluid amalgam of human features with a thing not to be identified on earth. The transfiguration was ghastlier than death or the changes of decay, and the face was already hued with the nameless, corrupt, and purulent color of the strange shadow, and had taken on, in respect to its outlines, a partial likeness to the squat profile of the shadow. The hands of the figure were not those of any Terran being, and the shape beneath the robe had lengthened with a nauseous, undulant pliancy, and the face and fingers seemed to drip in the moonlight with a deliquescent corruption, and the pursuing umbrage, like a thickly flowing blight, had corroded and distorted the very shadow of Evictus, which was now double in a manner not to be narrated here. Fain would I have cried or spoken aloud, but horror had dried up the fount of speech, and the thing that had been Evictus beckoned me in silence, uttering no word from its living and putrescent lips. And with eyes that were no longer eyes, but had become an oozing abomination, it peered steadily upon me. and it clutched my shoulder closely with the soft leprosy of its fingers, and led me half swooning with revulsion along the hall, and into that room where the mummy of Oegos, who had assisted us in the threefold incantations of the serpent men, was stationed with several of his fellows. By the lamps which illumined the chamber, burning with pale, still, perpetual flame, I saw that the mummies stood erect along the wall in their exanimate repose, each in his wonted place, with his tall shadow beside him. But the great, gaunt shadow of Oegos on the marble wall was companioned by an adumbration similar in all respects to the evil thing that had followed the master and was now incorporate with him. I remembered that Oegos had performed his share of the ritual, and had repeated an unknown stated word in turn after Avictus. And so I knew that the horror had come to Oegos in turn, and would wreak itself upon the dead even as on the living. For the foul, anonymous thing that we had called in our presumption could manifest itself to mortal ken in no other way than this. We had drawn it from unfathomable depths of time and space, using ignorantly a dire formula, and the thing had come at its own chosen hour to stamp itself in abomination uttermost upon the evocators. Since then, the night has ebbed away, and a second day has gone by like a sluggish ooze of horror. I have seen the complete identification of the shadow with the flesh and the shadow of Avictus, and also I have seen the slow encroachment of that other umbrage mingling itself with the lank shadow and the sere, bituminous body of Oegos, and turning them to a similitude of the thing which Avictus had become. And I have heard the mummy cry out like a living man in great pain and fear, as with the throes of a second dissolution at the impingement of the shadow. And long since it has grown silent, like the other horror, and I know not its thoughts or its intent. And verily I know not if the thing that has come to us be one or several, nor if its avatar will rest complete with the three that summoned it forth into time, or be extended to others. But these things, and much else, I shall soon know. For now, in turn, there is a shadow that follows mine, drawing ever closer. The air congeals and curdles with an unseen fear, and they that were our familiars had fled from the mansion, and the great marble women seem to tremble where they stand along the walls. But the horror that was Avictus, and the second horror that was Oegos, have left me not, and neither do they tremble. And with eyes that are not eyes, they seem to brood and watch, waiting till I too shall become as they. And their stillness is more terrible than if they had rended me limb from limb. And there are strange voices in the wind, and alien roarings upon the sea, and the walls quiver like a thin veil in the black breath of some remote abyss. So, knowing that the time I have is brief, I have shut myself in the room of volumes and books, and have written this account. And I have taken the bright triangular tablet, whose solution was our undoing, and have cast it from the window into the sea, hoping that none will find it after us. And now I must make an end, and enclose this writing in the sealed cylinder of aurichalcum, and fling it forth to drift upon the wave. For the space between my shadow and the shadow of the horror is straitened momently, and the space is no wider than the thickness of a wizard's pen. That's the end of that one. All right, we got two in. I'm glad. I didn't think we'd have time, but it's just in time. I have 10 minutes to make it to training. All right, folks, thanks for hanging out. I will catch you next time. Like I said, Friday is the new day. So, see you then. All right, have a good weekend. Take it easy.